Thank you. Yes, I've got two main motivations for doing the artwork that I do. One is to bring art out of the galleries and into the public domain, because I believe that, especially in some of the places where I work, the more neglected parts of our towns and cities, people just don't go to art galleries and they appreciate seeing art where they live. So I want to make art part of the fabric of everyday life. And also, in a way, the main motivating factor is that I want to draw attention to the environmental crisis that we're now living through, which a lot of people maybe don't realise the significance and the seriousness of it. And so I want to show people things that they might not know about or think about, and hopefully inspire through doing that a care and a concern and a desire to do something to protect those endangered species. This is the first big bird painting that I did. This is on the South Acton Estate in West London, and it's on a road called Bollow Bridge Road. And the reason I chose that was because there was a little river that used to flow along there called the River Bollow, and it's now under tarmac and concrete, and where it was once like water meadows and marshes in the floodplain of the Thames. And I just wanted to make the point about how this process is still continuing now, and in the process of modernisation and industrialisation, we're also losing a lot. I mean, this particular painting got an amazing reception when I did it. People were so appreciative of having artwork on their estate, and of all age groups, and it went across different nationalities. One Somali fella said to me, "Oh, my son could never get into trouble if he's standing next to a painting of a giant snipe." And it's also kind of an interesting insight into the way that environment affects behaviour. And if people live in a more beautiful, nature-friendly environment, they're more likely to behave in kind of more compassionate, understanding ways. I paint. The reason I paint local species, I paint British birds, is because I think that, say, were I to paint elephants or rhinos on these walls, even though this is a really significant problem, it somehow suggests that the problem is elsewhere, that it's not actually happening here. Whereas there is a serious decline in so many British birds at the moment, not just birds, but environmentally speaking generally. When I paint, I want to communicate. I try to paint them as realistically as possible, as I want to communicate my feelings, but also the beauty and character and individuality of these species, to give a greater understanding, to hopefully inspire this care and concern that I hope more people can have. Yeah, when I was a child growing up in the northwest, I used to love exploring the moors and the steeply wooded valleys where birds lived. And what struck me in recent years is, in my lifetime, that this sudden catastrophic decline in so many species has started to happen. It's like 40 years, like things like lapwings, kestrels, starlings, house sparrows, birds that were so common that I took for granted as being always there. They're now actually going. So this is what propelled me to the real need to try and express this and to do something about it. Yeah, I painted this great bustard in Whitechapel, and most people assumed that it was an ostrich and were wondering why on earth I was painting an ostrich in Whitechapel. And they were amazed to find out that it was actually a British bird, albeit one that became extinct in the 1830s. So I had a lot of interesting conversations about the concept of extinction and what it meant. And when I paint, my paintings usually take 2 or 3 days, so I have the opportunity to have lots of debates as I'm working, which also kind of creates new dialogues with people who I would not normally meet, or they would not normally know about these things. And this happens to be near a big hospital, and I get lots of positive messages from people saying how much they appreciate seeing a painting of a bustard on their way to and from the hospital because it cheers them up. This is on an extinction symbol. I painted this in Glastonbury Festival. The extinction symbol represents the 6th great extinction in the history of the Earth that we're now within. And scientists call this age the Anthropocene simply because human activity now is having the most profound effect on the environment, on the climate, more so than even geological events. So this turtle dove here is our fastest disappearing migratory bird. It's really heading towards extinction, and unless urgent measures are taken, it's going to disappear. And it's such a fundamental part, apart from anything else, of British history and folklore. They've been migrating to and from Africa for thousands of years. You know, they've been on these islands as long as we have, and I think it would be a great tragedy were they to disappear. And it's also representative of a big crisis in farmland birds generally, because of the industrialisation of farming has meant that hedgerows have disappeared, field margins disappeared, wildflowers, and the countryside is overloaded with huge amounts of toxic chemicals, pesticides and herbicides, which just rise year upon year. And this goshawk is about the importance of top predators in ecosystems. I painted this Walthamstow marshes because it struck me as a place where goshawks could naturally live. There's dozens of pairs of goshawks in Berlin, but none in London. And I was wondering why, because there's lots of pigeons, crows, squirrels around that they could eat. And I think one of the reasons is, probably the main reason, is they're very unpopular with the pheasant shooting industry, and that they're still persecuted. But there's a wonderful story about the importance of predators in ecosystems. In the US, in Yellowstone National Park, wolves were reintroduced after an absence of 100 years, and they had a dramatic impact, not only on the ecology of other birds and animals, but on the landscape itself. And that's because the deer that you used to browse on the young saplings on the riverbanks started to stay up in the hills, and this gave the saplings chance to grow, and therefore that stopped erosion of the riverbanks and stopped the collapse and stopped silt flowing into the rivers. And that meant that over time the water became cleaner and the fish became healthier and increased in numbers, and also myriad other species benefited from that. So that shows the huge effect that predators can have, and also the subtlety and unexpected nature of some of these relationships. And I've got a feeling that goshawks could have a similar effect, for example, on small bird numbers in this country, if they were allowed to flourish without persecution. I think it's very important to collaborate with scientists, conservation groups like the Wildlife Trusts and the RSPB, and groups like Human Nature Art, who put on exhibitions around the country and street art events, because we need to find ways to communicate these often complicated problems to a new audience. Because I think a lot of the time environmental matters are taken almost like a niche subject, and they're not taken seriously at will, whereas in my opinion the environment is absolutely fundamental. A healthy environment is what we all depend on ultimately, and we might feel that we're getting away with it at the moment, but the declines and the problems are so big that at some point we're going to have to change the way that we treat our environment. And nature deficit disorder is an interesting idea which has been spoken about quite a lot recently. It's the idea that as we lose contact with the earth and with nature, we become more and more alienated, and we actually start to suffer physically, emotionally and spiritually. Especially children who don't play out as much as they used to do, spend so much more time indoors and they don't know about the nature around them, they suffer. They can suffer in all sorts of ways, and there's quite a lot of evidence that if children spend time outside in the woods, just outdoors, climbing and playing, that really benefits them in multiple ways. So I think not only from the perspective of these beautiful species, but also the perspective of our health, that these things are absolutely important. Because social deprivation and environmental neglect so often occur in the same place. They're so often kind of intimately connected. I'm doing a tour of the UK with Human Nature Art to some of these most kind of environmentally deprived places to do some paintings to try and start this debate, talking about what could be done to improve the situation. Yeah, this was a part of a campaign to save a bit of green space. It's a missel thrush. Missel thrushes and people used to be able to relax on this bit of greenery, which unfortunately that campaign failed, and this is now under tarmac. Yeah, here we have a corner of a housing estate in South London, and this is typical of so many places in our towns and cities that are just neglected. This is what happened when the Wildlife Trust and local activists got together. And it's a small example of what is possible. I mean, people can come here and grow their own food and herbs and for their cooking, and also it's a nice place to meet. But it also shows the potential of cities as havens for pollinators and birds and lots of other species if this were to be repeated on a big scale. I think we need to start a kind of a movement of de-paving and digging up tarmac and planting trees and plants to really transform our towns and cities into, which could coexist with everything else, but it would create a more humane place in which to live. This woodpecker is a symbol of what is possible, and another major part of why street art is important to me is that it reclaimed something of public space from ubiquitous advertising, which none of us asked for, and especially car advertising, which sells an idea of cars as routes to freedom. And I think a bird is a much better symbol of freedom, a place, a green space in which to sit and clean air to breathe nearby where one lives, rather than having to travel to in a car, is a much greater expression of a real freedom. This is, again, is outside a community garden, an urban garden, where the food and herbs were grown in builders' bags because the ground was too toxic. But it just goes to show what can be achieved with ingenuity and inventiveness. And were this to be repeated, this kind of local effort on a major scale, a city like London could be transformed. It could become an absolute haven for a whole wealth of biodiversity. I think we need to embrace the idea of rewilding, renaturing, because it will just give a greater openness and kind of expansiveness to what we feel we can live with. I think there tends to be a culture of tidiness. For example, we seem to love clean lawns in this country, and the idea of an immaculate lawn being a virtue is something that I think could be challenged, because a lot of people don't realise that when they, for example, spray their roses with aphid spray or use weed killer on their lawn, they're also killing the food supply of the small birds that they'd like to see. And there's lots of small things that people can do in gardens, just for example making small ponds or leaving piles of logs, piles of leaves, because this kind of little small action repeated on a big scale could have a transformative effect. And I think that as I find doing these paintings empowering and as I'm painting momentarily, it kind of transcends the pain of a lot of what I'm dealing with. Likewise, small actions are empowering, and we really could see a much greener city townscape, especially as the countryside is now so diminished by the excessive use of chemicals, that cities and towns have this potential to be something absolutely new. Thank you.